Humanity is intoxicated by a singular, profoundly dangerous illusion. It is the arrogant, comforting belief that through the sheer force of iron, coal, and steam, we can successfully force the ancient, untamed physical universe to its knees. We operate under the naive assumption that our mathematical equations and our industrial blueprints possess a power greater than the raw, indifferent chaos of nature. In the late 19th century, the Industrial Revolution had gifted mankind with what felt like the power of gods. We believed we had finally acquired the absolute ability to reshape the very surface of the earth. We aggressively bored massive tunnels through the hearts of ancient mountains. We laid endless miles of steel tracks across desolate, frozen continents. We built colossal fire-breathing locomotives that devoured coal and spat out thick black clouds of progress. We sincerely believed that concrete, heavy stone, and forged steel were completely immune to the ancient wrath of the natural world. But nature does not respect our architecture, and the earth never bows to steel. Nature is simply an infinitely patient predator. It does not argue, it does not boast, it simply waits. It waits for the exact, fatal mathematical vulnerability. It waits for the wind to blow at precisely the right velocity. And when that exact, terrifying moment arrives, the grandest, most expensive monuments of human hubris are violently reduced to twisted scrap in a matter of seconds. This is not just a story of a train crash. This is the tragic, chilling story of what happens when human arrogance completely ignores the invisible, absolute laws of physics. The year is 1879. It is the absolute pinnacle of the Victorian era, a time when the British Empire spanned the globe, fueled by an insatiable hunger for industrial dominance. Spanning across the dark, freezing, and incredibly turbulent waters of the Firth of Tay in Scotland stood the ultimate physical manifestation of this imperial pride, the Tay Bridge. At the time of its completion, it was not merely a bridge, it was a breathtaking, colossal wonder of the modern world. Stretching an astonishing 2 miles across the desolate Scottish estuary, it was the longest railway bridge that humanity had ever dared to construct, an endless, repetitive spine of iron and stone that gracefully connected the shores of Fife to the bustling industrial city of Dundee. To the people of the Victorian age, the Tay Bridge was more than just a transportation route. It was a triumphant, physical declaration of war against the geographical limitations of the earth. The architect of this colossal iron leviathan was a highly ambitious civil engineer named Sir Thomas Bouch. For the successful creation of this unprecedented mechanical marvel, Bouch was knighted by Queen Victoria herself. He was celebrated as a visionary, a genius of the industrial age who had successfully tamed the dark, treacherous waters of the Scottish coast. But beneath the polished brass medals and the deafening public applause, a quiet, deeply fatal flaw was already rusting away at the core of the bridge. Sir Thomas Bouch's ambition and his relentless desire for prestige vastly outweighed the actual structural integrity of his iron pillars. The construction of the Tay Bridge had been plagued by extreme financial pressures and severe time constraints. Driven by the relentless demand to finish the project cheaply and quickly, Bouch made a series of catastrophic, fatal compromises. He drastically cut corners on the most fundamental aspects of the engineering process. The massive towering columns supporting the central spans of the bridge were originally designed to be built of solid, heavy brick and stone. But to save money, Bouch altered the blueprints, opting instead for cheap, highly brittle cast iron. The foundries that produced these iron columns were notoriously sloppy, pouring the molten metal unevenly, creating hidden, microscopic air pockets and fatal structural weaknesses deep within the iron. But Bouch's most terrifying, unforgivable sin was not merely the cheap materials. It was a mathematical omission of apocalyptic proportions. In his desperate rush to connect the two shores, Bouch completely, deliberately ignored a fundamental, brutal reality of the Scottish climate. He failed to adequately calculate wind loading, the immense aggressive lateral pressure that violent hurricane winds would exert against the towering iron lattice. He built a 2-mile-long iron sail and mathematically pretended that the wind did not exist. The Tay Bridge, the longest bridge on the planet, was essentially a fragile, brittle giant, perfectly designed to stand only on a perfectly calm day. It was a colossal, heavy iron house of cards, patiently waiting for the wind to blow. The date is December 28, 1879, a Sunday evening. As the dark, freezing winter night fell over the Scottish coast, nature finally decided to present Sir Thomas Bouch with the bill for his arrogance. The barometric pressure plummeted drastically. The sky over the Firth of Tay mutated into a bruised, churning black void, one of the most violent, aggressive, and merciless winter gales in the recorded history of Scotland, aggressively slammed into the coastal waters. Hurricane-force winds exceeding 70 miles per hour rushed up the estuary like a massive, invisible battering ram. The dark, freezing waters of the river transformed into a violently churning, chaotic abyss of massive, white-capped waves. Standing directly in the path of this localized apocalypse was the fragile cast-iron spine of the Tay Bridge. The wind aggressively howled through the intricate iron lattice of the high girders, the tallest, most exposed central section of the bridge. Under the immense, invisible, and sustained lateral pressure of the hurricane, the cheap cast iron began to experience extreme, agonizing mechanical stress. The entire 2-mile structure moaned in the dark. The iron columns violently vibrated, the cheap restraining bolts slowly, silently loosening under the rhythmic assault of the storm. At exactly the same time, miles away on the southern shore, a powerful Edinburgh to Dundee steam locomotive was roaring blindly into the teeth of the storm. It was pulling 6 heavy wooden passenger carriages filled with 75 souls, men returning from business, women visiting relatives, and young children returning from holiday celebrations. Outside the windows of the train, the weather was an absolute, blinding, freezing nightmare. But inside the wooden carriages, a terrifying, tragic illusion of safety prevailed. The compartments were softly illuminated by the warm, comforting yellow glow of oil gas lamps. The passengers sat on plush seats, wrapped in thick wool coats, listening to the rhythmic, reassuring clack-clack of the steel wheels on the rails. They looked out at the pitch-black, howling storm, feeling entirely protected by the heavy iron and roaring steam of the locomotive. They placed their absolute blind faith in the majestic, world-famous bridge they were about to cross. They genuinely believed that the genius of Victorian engineering had successfully insulated them from the wrath of the freezing night. At exactly 7:15 in the evening, the heavy steam locomotive reached the southern entrance of the Tay Bridge. It aggressively pushed onto the iron tracks, moving at a cautious but steady speed, entering the endless dark tunnel of iron girders. On the northern shore, anxious signalmen sat in their small, dimly lit control cabin, staring out into the blinding, chaotic storm. Through the heavy rain and the dark, howling wind, they watched the faint, warm yellow lights of the train carriages slowly crawling out over the black water. The train was a tiny, fragile string of glowing embers, bravely creeping toward the highly exposed, 88-foot-high central section of the bridge. The high girders, as the massive steam engine entered the central span, it introduced tons of heavy, moving kinetic weight to the already agonizingly stressed iron structure. The cheap cast iron was now fighting a horrific two-front war: the immense vertical weight of the roaring train and the apocalyptic lateral pressure of the hurricane winds. And then, the fatal mathematical omission reached its absolute breaking point. A sudden, unimaginably violent gust of wind, a massive, invisible hammer of compressed air, slammed directly into the side of the train and the iron lattice. The physical limits of the brittle cast iron were instantly, violently exceeded. The signalmen on the shore watched in breathless horror as a catastrophic flash of bright, aggressive white light suddenly erupted in the pitch-black darkness of the storm. It was a massive shower of sparks, created by heavy, tearing iron violently grinding against iron. In a fraction of a millisecond, the central span of the longest bridge in the world completely catastrophically shattered. The heavy iron pillars snapped like dry, brittle twigs. The massive steel ties violently ripped from their moorings. The entire central section of the high girders, a structure weighing hundreds of tons, completely collapsed. For one agonizing, terrifying, gravity-defying fraction of a second, the roaring steam locomotive and its 6 glowing wooden carriages were entirely suspended in midair. The tracks beneath them simply ceased to exist. And then the iron, the wood, the steam, and the 75 human souls were violently claimed by the abyss. The entire train plummeted 90 feet straight down into the pitch-black freezing and violently churning waters of the River Tay. The signalman on the shore watched the faint yellow lights of the passenger carriages fall rapidly through the darkness. When the heavy iron and wood aggressively slammed into the surface of the freezing river, the lights were instantly, permanently extinguished. The absolute unyielding darkness of the ocean swallowed them whole. The true psychological horror of the Tay Bridge disaster did not happen in the air. It happened entirely beneath the surface of the freezing black water. Claustrophobia is a terror we normally associate with small, tight spaces. But the most absolute devastating form of claustrophobia is being trapped inside a heavy wooden box as it rapidly sinks into a freezing, pitch-black void. As the heavy wooden passenger carriages aggressively plunged beneath the icy waves, the violent impact shattered the glass windows. The warm, comforting oil gas lamps that had provided the illusion of safety were instantly killed by the rushing, freezing water. The 75 passengers were plunged into an absolute, suffocating, and terrifying pitch-black darkness. The doors of the wooden carriages were heavily locked from the outside, a standard railway procedure of the era designed to keep passengers from falling out during the journey. That safety protocol instantly mutated the carriages into inescapable, sinking wooden coffins. There was absolutely no escape. There was no light. There was no air. In the absolute, terrifying darkness of the submerged train, the freezing, violent river water aggressively poured in from every shattered window and cracked wooden seam. The panicked, desperate screams of 75 souls were instantly muffled, swallowed entirely by the heavy, indifferent dark water. It was a suffocating, pitch-black, and absolute erasure of human life. The violent, swirling currents of the Firth of Tay showed absolutely no mercy to the innocent victims of Sir Thomas Boucher's arrogance. In less than 3 agonizing minutes, the massive steam engine and all 6 wooden carriages settled into the dark, muddy bottom of the estuary. 75 men, women, and children were permanently erased from the physical universe. The ocean demanded a sacrifice for the arrogant trespass of iron, and it claimed every single soul on the bridge. The survival rate of the Tay Bridge disaster was an absolute mathematical zero. When the gray, bleak dawn finally broke over the Scottish coast the next morning, the storm had completely passed. The heavy, dark clouds parted, revealing a calm, incredibly cold, and eerily quiet river, but the morning light illuminated a scene of unimaginable, deeply humiliating devastation. Standing in the middle of the dark water, the 2-mile-long iron monument of Victorian pride had been brutally amputated. A massive, gaping half-mile hole existed in the exact center of the bridge, its jagged, torn iron edges pointing accusingly down into the dark water. It looked exactly like a giant set of shattered, broken teeth, violently ripped out by the fist of the ocean. Down below, the dark, freezing waters of the river completely hid the horrific wooden tombs of the 75 passengers. Over the following weeks, recovery divers descended into the pitch-black, freezing depths to survey the absolute wreckage. They found the heavy steam locomotive completely crushed in the mud, entangled in the massive, twisted web of cheap cast-iron girders. They found the locked wooden carriages, heavily waterlogged and shattered, still containing the frozen, silent victims of the disaster. The recovery of the bodies was a slow, agonizing, and deeply traumatic process for the entire nation. Vintage leather suitcases, soaked wool coats, and children's toys slowly washed ashore on the desolate, freezing Scottish beaches. Each item served as a dark, melancholic reminder of the catastrophic cost of human hubris. The subsequent government inquiry was absolutely ruthless in its findings. The official report concluded that the Tay Bridge was badly designed, badly constructed, and badly maintained. Sir Thomas Boucher, the celebrated architectural genius of the Victorian era, was completely, publicly humiliated. His reputation was entirely shattered, his engineering legacy reduced to a monument of cheap iron and senseless death. The heavy, unbearable weight of guilt and the complete destruction of his pride broke his mind and body. Less than a year after the disaster, Boucher died. A broken, disgraced man, destroyed by the very wind he had arrogantly ignored. The Tay Bridge disaster sent a profound, terrifying shockwave through the global engineering community. It was a dark, defining lesson in humility. It violently reminded humanity that we cannot cheat the laws of physics to save money. We cannot build colossal iron sails and pretend that the wind will not blow. The physical universe is utterly indifferent to our grand opening ceremonies, our royal medals, and our arrogant blueprints. If we build our monuments on a foundation of cheap materials and mathematical ignorance, nature will patiently wait for the perfect storm to violently correct our mistake. The twisted, rusted stumps of the original cast iron bridge pillars still violently protrude from the dark, freezing waters of the Firth of Tay today. They run parallel to a newer, much stronger bridge, serving as a permanent, haunting graveyard marker. They are silent, rusted tombstones warning every passing train of the absolute, terrifying power of the unseen wind. The 75 souls locked inside those sinking wooden carriages paid the ultimate price for the hubris of the industrial age. We pretend that we control the earth with iron and steam, but the storm always writes the final rule. History is not dead. It is never dead. It merely slumbers beneath the freezing, dark, churning waters of our forgotten past, patiently waiting to be remembered by the arrogant generations that inevitably follow. We will meet again in the next era, when humanity once more forgets the terrifying silent warnings written in cheap iron and roaring wind. You are watching past Resurrected. Until the next era, silence, faint sound of cold wind, and distant train whistle.